And we're live. So just gonna read the section on the idea, and let's see how far into the, if we make it into the concept of life. I think this is somewhere like maybe 10 pages, probably a bit less. But it's a general, Hegel's general introduction of the concept of the idea, which is right after the concepts of, the major concepts of the concept and objectivity. And I already did a few pages of reading on this, and it's good. Alright, so the idea is the adequate concept, the objectively true, or the true as such. If anything has truth, it has it by virtue of its idea, or something has truth only insofar as it is idea. The expression idea has otherwise also often been used in philosophy as well as in ordinary life for concept, or even for just a representation. To say that to say that I still have no idea of this lawsuit, this building, this region, means nothing more than I still have no representation of it. It is Kant who reclaimed the expression idea for the concept of reason. Now, according to Kant, the concept of reason should be the concept of the unconditional, but a concept which is transcendent with respect to appearances, that is, one for which no adequate empirical use can be made. The concepts of reason are supposed to serve for the comprehension of perceptions, those of the understanding for the understanding of them. In fact, however, if these last concepts of the understanding are truly concepts, then they are comprehensions, which means concepts. They will make comprehending possible, and an understanding of perceptions through concepts of the understanding will be a comprehending. But if understanding is only the determining of perceptions by categories such as whole or part, force, cause, and the like, then it signifies only determining by means of reflection, just as by understanding one may mean only the determinate representation of a fully determined sensuous content, as when someone is being shown the way that at the end of the wood he must turn left, and he replies, I understand. Understanding means nothing more than a grasp in pictorial representation and in memory. Concept of reason, too, is a somewhat clumsy expression, for the concept is in general something rational, and insofar as reason is distinguished from the understanding and the concept as such, it is the totality. The totality of the concept and objectivity. The idea is the rational in this sense. It is the unconditioned, because only that has conditions which essentially refers to an objectivity that it does not determine itself, but which still stands over against it in the form of indifference and externality, just as the external purpose had conditions. I think one way that one might put that in everyday terminologies is that the idea is the rational in the sense that one, it is rationality itself. Two, it is that which is distinguished and through which the distinguishing is distinguished. It is the whole which parts the parts as parts of itself. Because there was this post maybe 2 weeks back or something on Reddit, on the Hegel Reddit, and somebody asked, what does Hegel mean by rationality? I didn't post anything because and everybody gave a terrible answer, but for me, the answer is pretty simple, and it's literally in the very etymology of the word, rational, ratio. A ratio is one, relational, and two, fractional, also just parted. A ration is a part. Reason is therefore the process of making distinctions, and in order to make distinctions you need a unified whole in which distinctions inhere, and that is reasoning as a total whole. So the idea as truth is the domain in which the very distinction between the untrue and the true is rationed, and in which the measure of truth and the objects which it corresponds to, or rather the objects that correspond to it, are themselves also rationed. So, I don't know, I think that makes sense, but that's just me.
That makes sense to me. It's everywhere and in everywhere, but it's also the everywhere insofar as the everywhere is distinct from everywhere else. It's like it's a pure in-betweenness, or like a distinction in itself, kind of. It inhabits what it distinguishes, and it inhabits itself as the distinguishing of what is distinguished.
Yep. If we now reserve the expression idea for the objective or real concept, and we distinguish it from the concept itself and still more from mere representation, then we must also even more definitely reject that estimate of it according to which the idea is something with no actuality, and true thoughts are accordingly said to be only ideas. If thoughts are something merely subjective and contingent, then they certainly have no further value. But in this, they do not stand lower than the temporal and contingent actualities, which likewise have no further value than that of accidentalities and appearances. I like that. That's a thought that nobody considers. They're like, oh, well, reason may not be true. Well, if reason is, just kind of a subjective thing, then why isn't the rest of everything else, just as equally like meaningless and subjective? It's like, well, that's just like your opinion, man. Well, like, that's just your experience, man. Which people do, but like nobody ever like thinks about it fully there. Some people do, but they don't. They're more of just like weird nihilists and skeptics of an often inconsistent kind. It's the people who really do consider that, like, maybe you really do experience the world in a completely different way, which I do not experience. To which case, the answer is indeed, like, that's just your experience, man. But beyond that, what value is there to saying that? Nothing. But if, on the contrary, the idea is supposed not to have the value of truth, because in regard to appearances it is transcendent, because no congruent object can be given for it in the world of the senses, then this is indeed an odd misunderstanding, for objective validity is being denied to it on the ground that it lacks precisely what makes of appearances the untrue being of the objective world. In regard to the practical ideas, Kant recognizes that quote, nothing can be more harmful and unworthy of a philosopher than the vulgar appeal to experience, which supposedly contradicts the idea. Any such alleged contradiction would not be there at all if, for example, political institutions were set up at the right time in accordance with ideas, and if crude concepts, crude just because they are drawn from experience, had not usurped the place of ideas, thus thwarting all good intentions, unquote. Kant regards the idea as something necessary, the goal which, as the archetype, we must strive to set up as a maximum, and to which we must bring actuality as it presently stands ever closer. That's a good argument for, you give a conception, then people say, point to empirical, to an empirical denial or counterfactual. And I do agree that, you can just literally go and sure that happens, but who cares? It's like saying, people, Hegel says people are essentially rational, and this goes back to medieval and ancient Greek considerations about what it is to be human. And then somebody goes like, nuh-uh, look, I'm an idiot. I'm like, well, yes, you're an idiot, but if you weren't an idiot, you would accede to the fact that you were rational. And even the very denial, like, look, I'm an idiot. You're giving reasons, so you're being rational.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, that's just like a really like low-hanging fruit example, but another example that's a bit more difficult, or at least people would think so, is the example like people say like, oh, the world's essentially good, for example, which Hegel does. He eventually does say, and then it would be like, look at all the bad things that happen, and the response would be that well, that's only within a certain crude perspective of the world. Which, in the immediacy of things, you'll be like, that's not a good argument, but that's not where we're making this argument here. Continuing, but since the result now is that the idea is the unity of the concept and objectivity, the true, we must not regard it as just a goal, which is to be approximated but itself remains always a kind of beyond. We must rather regard everything as being actual only to the extent that it has the idea in it and expresses it. It is not just that the subject matter, the objective and the subjective world ought to be in principle congruent with the idea. The two are themselves rather the congruence of concept and reality. A reality that does not correspond to the concept is a mere appearance, something subjective, accidental, arbitrary, something which is not the truth. When it is said that there is no subject matter to be found in experience, which is perfectly congruent with the idea, the latter is opposed to the actual as a subjective standard, but there is no saying what anything actual might possibly be in truth. If its concept is not in it and its objectivity does not measure up to its concept, it would then be a nothing. So this is an issue that comes up. It's like people. I had this discussion with a guy who ran the Hegel subreddit a few months ago. I know he thought that it was a problem that, he's like, fine, okay, Hegel might be right about, how we think of concepts and whatnot, but like, how do we know that we are applying the proper concept or to a thing? And my response to him was like, well, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, and as far as you can tell in its appearance, it's showing everything that the duck, that which accords to the concept of a duck, then it's a fucking duck. You say, well, what if it wasn't a duck? What if it's, some kind of like 5-dimensional gnome, pretending to be a duck and just appearing to be a duck? Well, I'm like, well, if it was, would you have a reason to, stipulate that it was anything different? If you have a reason, you have a reason, and therefore, there you go. There's your logical ground for that. If you don't, then why would you think otherwise? What he says, but there's no saying what anything actual might possibly be in truth. If its concept is not in it and its objectivity does not measure up to this concept, it would then be a nothing. So, that skeptical idea of like, what if everything was just completely different and unlike anything we perceive? I'm like, well, if it was, what would you be talking about? If all you have to say is like, well, what if it was different? I don't know. Then you're not talking about anything at all. You don't. If you don't have a concept to which it's being measured, and you're just saying, well, what if its concept which is radically different? Well, what concept are you talking about?
Yeah, they miss that they're determining the nature of what they're opposing, and the nature of the thing they're opposing it with. Like, they're completely involved in both sides, and therefore they're conceptualizing it.
And I think that there is no issue about like, what if we're applying the wrong concept? if the object does not fit the concept you're using, like that itself is a rational tell that, either one, you're not using a very helpful concept, or two, the thing just really isn't much of what you're talking about in the first place. And, and you should be able to tell by the way in which the actual activities and being of that thing and the structure and dynamics of it, like, align with the conception that you have, whether you're using a proper concept or not, a concept fit towards it. Because you could talk about things in a way in which, like Schelling does this sometimes. If you're being like poetic and artistic, it's cool. If you're trying to talk about it seriously, only in the most like high, typical like hippie and like stoner levels of thinking, like does it really land as like, well, yeah, that's a cool thing and interesting perspective, but it's kind of useless, like I think there's a quote from Schelling in which Schelling says, we could think about it's not that a mechanical thing it's not that a living thing is a more advanced mechanical thing. Rather, you could think about mechanical things as being primitive living things, an incomplete life, a failed living thing. You could think about things that way, but why would you? Like it's you can measure things by that concept, but it's so far away from the actual practical usage of that word in any regular way that unless the worldview radically shifts towards some kind of biocentrism in which people then decide to start looking at the world as one giant living organism, which there are people who do, both philosophers and even not philosophers. It's still a weird perspective to take, all things given, but that's just sort of social dynamics in the way we use common language. But you can tell when you're using things within a certain like pragmatic measure, I suppose. I mean, if you find something to be intelligible, you find it to be intelligible. There's no sin in that. But it'd be like Deleuze talking about a geology of morals, for example, right? You could, but why would you? So, indeed, the mechanical and the chemical object, like a subject devoid of spirit and a spirit conscious only of finitude and not of its essence, do not, according to their various natures, have their concept concretely existing in them in its own free form. But they can be something at all true only insofar as they are the union of their concept and reality, of their soul and their body. Wholes like the state and the church cease to exist in concreto when the unity of their concept and their reality is dissolved. The human being, the living thing, is dead when soul and body are parted in it. Dead nature, the mechanical and the chemical world, that is, when the dead is taken to mean the inorganic world, for the expression would otherwise have no positive meaning at all. This dead nature, then, if it is separated into its concept and its reality, is nothing but the subjective abstraction of a thought form and a formless matter. Spirit that were not idea, not the unity of the concept with itself, not the concept that has the concept itself as its reality, would be dead spirit, spiritless spirit, immaterial object. The example of the state in church is a good one. Insofar as, how is the state in church true? Well, insofar as, the unity of its concept, the concept of being, the conscious will of a people, their living ethos, and its reality, which would be its institutions, is dissolved, It's like the U.S. The U.S. Is a dead state for the most part. The difference, the very real and abstract difference between like what the state of state is and what the people as people are is so wide that the state is basically dead. Like there is no soul in it. There is no, what was that? No Volksgeist, no folk spirit, so to say. I think Christianity is pretty much the same. Like, most of Christianity now is just dead insofar as, like, it doesn't really have an animating living ethos anymore. It's just a cultural appearance nowadays for most people. And I like that Hegel says that thing about the nature, that the concept of dead only makes sense as, comparing living organic life and the inorganic elements of life, where life is the totality of the dead things, in dynamic unity with themselves. Continuing, since the idea is the unity of the concept and reality, being has attained the significance of truth. It now is, therefore, only what the idea is. Finite things are finite because, to the extent that they do not possess the reality of their concept completely within them, but are in need of other things for it, or conversely, because they are presupposed as objects and consequently the concept is in them as an external determination. The highest to which they attain on the side of this finitude is external purposiveness. That actual things are not congruent with the idea constitutes the side of their finitude, of their untruth, and it is according to this side that they are objects, each in accordance with its specific sphere, and in the relations of objectivity determined as mechanical, chemical, or by an external purpose. That the idea has not perfectly fashioned their reality, that it has not completely subjugated it to the concept, the possibility of that rests on the fact that the idea itself has a restricted content, that as essentially as it is the unity of the concept and reality, just as essentially it is also their difference. For only the object is the immediate unity, that is, the unity that only exists in itself. But if a subject matter, say the state, did not at all conform to its idea, that is to say, if it were not rather the idea of the state, if its reality, which is the self-conscious individuals, did not correspond at all to the concept, its soul and body would have come apart. The soul would have taken refuge in the secluded regions of thought, the body being dispersed into singular individualities. But because the concept of the state is essential to the nature of these individualities, it is present in them as so mighty an impulse that they are driven to translate it into reality, be it only in the form of external purposiveness, or to put up with it as it is, or else they must needs perish. The worst state, one whose reality least corresponds to the concept insofar as it still has concrete existence, is yet idea. The individuals still obey the power of a concept. How's that for authority? Alright. But the idea has not only the general meaning of true being, of the unity of concept and reality, but also the more particular one of the unity of subjective concept and objectivity. For the concept is, as such, itself already the identity of itself and reality. For the indeterminate expression reality means nothing but determinate being, and this the concept possesses in its particularity and singularity. Objectivity, moreover, is likewise the total concept that has withdrawn into identity with itself out of its determinateness. In the subjectivity of the concept, the determinateness or the difference of the latter is a reflective shine, which is immediately sublated, withdrawn into being for itself, or into negative unity and inhering predicate. But in this objectivity, the determinateness is posited as immediate totality, as external whole. Now the idea has shown itself to be the concept liberated again into its subjectivity from the immediacy into which it has sunk in the object. It is the concept that distinguishes itself from its objectivity, but an objectivity which is no less determined by it, and possesses its substantiality only in that concept. This identity has therefore rightly been designated as a subject-object, for it is just as well the formal or subjective concept as it is the object as such. But this is a point that needs further precision. The concept, inasmuch as it has truly attained its reality, is this absolute judgment whose subject distinguishes itself as self-referring negative unity from its objectivity and is the latter's being in and for itself. But it refers to it essentially through itself and is, therefore, self-directed purpose and impulse. For this very reason, however, the subject does not possess objectivity immediately in it, for it would then be only the totality of the object as such, a totality lost in the objectivity, but is the realization of the purpose, an objectivity posited by virtue of the activity of the purpose, one which, as positedness, has its subsistence in its form only as permeated by its subject. As objectivity, it has the moment of the externality of the concept in it, and is in general, therefore, the side of finitude, of alteration and appearance. But this side retreats into the negative unity of the concept, and there it perishes. The negativity whereby its indifferent externality of being manifests itself as an essential and as a positiveness is the concept itself. Despite this objectivity, the idea is therefore absolutely simple and immaterial, for the externality has being only as determined by the concept and as taken up into its negativity. Insofar as it exists and as indifferent externality, it is not only abandoned to mechanism in general, but exists only as the transitory and untrue. Thus, although the idea has its reality in immateriality, the latter is not an abstract being standing over against the concept, but on the contrary, it exists only as becoming, as simple determinateness of the concept by virtue of the negativity of the indifferent being. So a lot of concepts of later stuff, but for those who have been watching our progress in the science of logic, a lot of this follows the forms or echoes forms that we've already seen in the very first two chapters of the science of logic, which is interesting. It sort of shows you that there's a recurring methodology and a general form that does appear in the entire movements of everything that goes on the logic. It just becomes clearer and clearer as the logic moves on, and there's different ways to think about it in more and more concrete ways. Here the idea can be thought of as the something in chapter 2, with its the concept and objectivity being the limited internal determination of that something, the otherness within that something, the unity of subject and object, and how something being something doubles it within itself. That something is something determinate within itself, determined therefore, and has a determination, and it has its otherness, and blah blah blah. And that's a neat set of conceptual analogies that happen. Continuing, this yields the following closer determinations of the idea. First, the idea is the simple truth, the identity of concept and objectivity, as a universal in which the opposition, the presence of the particular, is dissolved in its self-identical negativity and its equality with itself. Second, it is the connection of the subjectivity of the simple concept existing for itself and of the concept objectivity which is distinguished from it. The former is essentially the impulse to sublate the separation. The latter is indifferent positiveness, subsistence which in and for itself is null. As this connection, the idea is the process of disrupting itself into individuality and into the latter's inorganic nature, and of then bringing this inorganic nature again under the controlling power of the subject and back to the first simple universality. The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process. The thought that liberates actuality from the seeming of purposeless Mutability and transfigures it into idea must not represent this truth of actuality as dead repose, as a mere picture, numb, without impulse and movement, as a genius or number, or as an abstract thought. The idea, because of the freedom which the concept has attained in it, also has the most stubborn opposition within it. Its repose consists in the assurance and the certainty with which it eternally generates that opposition and eternally overcomes it, and in it rejoins itself. I think in already that paragraph you can easily start seeing like why the immediacy of the idea is taken to be life, or is called life, because that whole process of diremption, embodiment, subsumption of that embodiment into a unity again, it's literally life. It's one cell transforms into 2 cells, 3, blah blah blah, comes back into the unity of organic whole, and a body reproduces yet again and just keeps going and going. But the idea is at first, again, only immediate, or only in its concept. The objective reality is indeed conformable to the concept, but has not yet been liberated into the concept, and it does not concretely exist explicitly as the concept. Thus, the concept is indeed the soul, but the soul is in the guise of an immediate. That is, it is not determined as soul itself, has not comprehended itself as soul, does not have its objective reality within itself. The concept is as a soul that is not yet fully animated. Thus, the idea is, first of all, life. It is the concept which, distinct from its objectivity, simple in itself, permeates that objectivity, and as self-directed purpose, has its means within it and posits it as its means, yet is immanent to it, yet is immanent in this means, and is therein the realized purpose identical with itself. The idea, on account of its immediacy, has singularity for the form of its concrete existence. But the reflection within it of its absolute process is the sublating of this immediate singularity. Thereby the concept, which as universality is in the singularity the inner, transforms externality into universality, or posits its objectivity as a self-equality. Thus is the idea, in second place, the idea of the true and the good, as cognition and will. It is at first finite cognition and finite will, where the true and the good are still distinguished. The two are at first only as a goal. The concept has first liberated itself into itself, giving itself only a still abstract objectivity for its reality. But the process of this finite cognition and this finite action transforms the initially abstract universality into totality, whereby it becomes complete objectivity. Or, considered from the other side, finite, that is subjective spirit, makes for itself the presupposition of an objective world, such a presupposition as life only has. But its activity is the sublating of this presupposition and turning of it into something posited. Thus, its reality is for it the objective world, or conversely, the objective world is the ideality in which it knows itself. Third, spirit recognizes the idea as its absolute truth, as the truth that is in and for itself, the infinite idea in which cognizing and doing are equalized, and which is the absolute knowledge of itself. All right, so that was the introduction to the idea. Any thoughts? I mean, I think those are very interesting, what would you call those, intimations and foresights, or foretellings of what's developed later on. This is actually the first time I read this in full. I've only read like a couple pages before. There's a lot of stuff here in which like I knew just from like working out chapter 1 and chapter 2 and just thinking about that for quite a while. The thing about, at the end here, the infinite idea in which cognizing and doing are equalized, which is the absolute knowledge of itself. Where pure thought is pure idea, pure activity, pure doing. That action is substance, if one wants to make that kind of a conceptual determination. And that actually is true from the very beginning. From the very beginning of the science of logic, what is really the object of all inquiry is just the activity of thinking. That's why the whole logic is permeated by becoming, and enframed within it, and consequent of it, in that what we begin with is never an unmoving thing. We already begin in motion from the very beginning. So let me end the stream here just for categorization's sake, so that this can remain like an independent little section, and then we'll start on the section on life.